it's a good thing that you're here. So we can just get started. So automatically, I just gained myself a co-host, Atunika. Thank you. And you could help.
Hi, Dr. John.
Hello, nice to meet all of you.
Okay, so just to start, basically, hi everyone. This is Open Source Stories with Regina. And what we do basically here is that we share stories of leading women in open source projects. So this program basically is to inspire, motivate women contribution to open source projects. So just for you to know that this Twitter space is currently being recorded and it will be converted to a podcast. This podcast is currently available on Amazon, Google, and Apple Podcast. So you just simply have to search for Open Source Stories Regina, and you would see past interviews with other people that I've interviewed on this program. And so today, I'm so glad to have someone here, and she is Dr. Dawn Foster. I had a close interaction with Dr. Dawn, and I think that was about 2 years ago. So I joined the Chaos Project for occasional contributors metrics. Um, and that was the time I actually had more like a close interaction with her for that particular metrics. And I see that she's an amazing person. She has inspired quite a lot of people in open source, and I'm so glad that she is here currently with us.
Aw, thank you.
So just to read out our bio for the sake of recording. So Dr. Dawn works as it's August, and I think I would say congratulations, Dr. Dawn. She's going to be working as the director of data science for the Chaos Project, where she is also a board member and a maintainer. That's awesome. She is the co-chair of CNCF Tag Contributor Strategy and an open UK board member. She has 20 plus years experience at companies like VMware and Intel with expertise in community building, strategy, open source governance, metrics, and more. She has spoken at over 100 industry events and has a PhD, an MBA, and a BS in computer science. And she says in her spare time, she enjoys reading science fiction, running, and traveling. Once again, Dr. Dawn, I am so glad to have you here today, and you're welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I took my time to basically look at your blog, which is Fast Wonder. Guys, if you've not looked at our blog, go and check it out. It is actually, you could actually spend your whole day at Dr. Dawn's blog. It has everything you're looking for from our speaking engagement and everything. And I was thinking of how then do we start this conversation? How do we begin this conversation? Um, I would like you to tell us a little bit about your background. Like, how did you get involved with open source? What's your story?
Yeah, so I got involved in open source sort of accidentally. I came out of university back in the mid 90s with a computer science degree, and I started working as a Unix systems administrator. And at the time, I worked for a manufacturing company, so they didn't want to pay for software. They considered IT more of an expense than an investment. So I used a lot of open source software kind of in my day-to-day role as a sysadmin. I didn't contribute. I didn't really understand open source at that point, but I did use it. And then 5 years later, when I started at Intel back in 2000 or so, they needed someone to look at some open source developer tools and some Linux developer tools to see which ones might be strategic for the company moving forward into the future. And they looked at me and they were like, well, you did Unix, that's kind of like Linux, and you've used open source, which was more than most people at Intel back in 2000 had done. So I sort of got tagged with doing this project. And a big part of this strategic analysis of whether or not some of these projects were going to continue to be successful and strategic for Intel moving forward was looking at the community. Was it active? Were there people actually doing things? Were they making regular releases? So I started getting more and more fascinated with how these communities worked. And so I started eventually doing presentations at conferences about open source communities and kind of how they worked and how they were structured. And this somebody saw me give one of these presentations and was like, "Hey, we need a community manager. Would you be up for that?" It was a startup at the time that was never successful. Nobody's ever heard of them at this point. But that was in about 2006 or so. And so then I started managing communities pretty much full time, for a number of years. So I worked at several startups. I had a consulting company. I eventually went back to Intel and worked on a couple of mobile open source operating systems as community manager. I went to Puppet. I was the director of community there. And then I actually took some time off and went back to school to get a PhD. So I got my PhD by studying the Linux kernel and looking at how people collaborate within the Linux kernel. And so I spent a few years doing that. And then when I finished that, I ended up at Pivotal working on basically open source strategy and some Kubernetes strategy in particular. And then we got acquired by VMware, and I ended up in the open source program office, which is a fantastic place to work. And it was really hard for me to leave. Monday was my last day at VMware, so it was hard to leave. But the director of data science position at Chaos really is my dream job. I get to play with data, and I get to do that as kind of the full-time focus of my role. So I'm really excited. I am taking most of July off, with the exception of going to Fosse, and then I'm really looking forward to to starting that in August.
Well, yeah, I saw a post where you posted about not being easy actually leaving VMware. Just thinking about how you started up from school, working at Intel, and then realizing that there was a gap within our communities actually build open source software. Would you say that this was more like what inspired you, motivated your journey into open source?
Um, yeah, I mean, what motivated me to get more and more involved in open source over the years was really the communities, and I was just fascinated by how these communities worked, because I think naively back when I was using open source software as a sysadmin, I sort of thought that people, I just didn't understand how people would sort of throw things together and you eventually end up with something that works really, really well. And I didn't understand that there was all this structure, and the communities have this structure. There's governance structure. There are people in leadership positions. There's all of this stuff that isn't necessarily obvious unless you're looking deeply at the community. And so I started getting fascinated by that. And then when I actually started managing some of these communities and getting more and more involved, the people I met were just absolutely fascinating. And so I've just met so many really amazing people who, yeah, they do open source work, but generally you talk to people and they also do all of these other interesting things. And you keep running into them in different communities that you're a part of, and you keep seeing these same people over and over. And I do find it just really, just that the people are really, really amazing. So it's the community that keeps me around.
I think that you would agree with me that the people is basically one of the things that makes people want to be part of open source. So this brings me back to more like a regular question that have had people ask me and they want me to ask you as well. It's basically looking at your journey. I would call your journey a progressive career journey and career path because you had moved from one stage to the other stage and um, I think that you at some point understood where you should be and you stayed on that path. How then do you balance your personal life, your career, and then your open source contributions? Um, why I'm asking this question is basically that we are fortunate in this era that we have organizations that are basically now, they are now paid in internship. But research has shown that the vast majority within the open source ecosystem as contributors, they are working as volunteers. So how did you manage your progressive career, being available for open source work and your personal life?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I Because early in my career, I did not balance that well at all, to be honest. I did a lot of conferences. I still do a lot of conferences, but I think I have gotten better at pacing myself especially when I travel to conferences, like the open source conferences. And so it used to be I felt like I had to do everything. So, I'd have breakfast with people. I'd be going from, 7 o'clock in the morning until, midnight every day during the conference. And I've realized that, I need to take a little time out in the middle of the day to relax. I maybe need to not stay and be the last person at the party. And then it's okay to take some time for myself at those conferences. Because I did burn out of two jobs. I burnt out at Puppet and I burnt out at Intel my second time there. And I was just absolutely exhausted and not productive at all. And so what I've realized is that I really need to take the time for myself. And so, now I protect my personal time pretty viciously. And, being in Europe, I do sometimes have late meetings, but that means that I start later, or, maybe I start early and take a 2 or 3 hour lunch. And making time to work out, making time for Pilates or to go for a run, or even just to take a walk at some point during the day, because I think it's really important to have that balance. Now, I've also been super fortunate in that my jobs have allowed me to contribute to open source in my work time. So it's a lot easier for me to protect that personal time, because I can make most of those open source contributions during work hours. And that doesn't mean it doesn't occasionally bleed over, but I try really hard to protect my personal time, because I think it's just so important to have time for yourself and your friends and your family.
Yeah, sure. Could you share some of the things that you do to basically protect your personal time?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually block it out on my calendar. In particular when I'm, when I was working at VMware, because people will tend to schedule you for things. And so I was willing to take meetings up until 7 p.m. But I blocked my calendar after 7 p.m. and basically just said I'm not available for meetings after this time. And then I would, the previous week, I would look at next week's schedule and I would see which days I had to work late. And then I would block a couple of the other days off. So, I'm not available for meetings from 6 to 7 on two of the days, so that I'm not working until 7 o'clock every single night. And then I block that time off at lunch. So that if I take a 2 hour lunch because I'm working late, I block that time on my calendar too. And so I block the time on my calendar, and then I make sure that I don't work during that time. So in particular, the lunchtime generally tends to be when I go for a run or go for a walk or do something like that. Play some Beat Saber on my VR headset, something like that.
Quite interesting. I mean, thanks for the practical insights about that one. Looking
Yeah.
at when you actually started your open source journey, um, I was really fascinated about how you basically took on your career. And now being in the Chaos Project, knowing that this particular space is basically for inspiring women, right, into open source projects, contributions, and all of that. How has your experiences in open source, how has it been shaped? How has it shaped your perspective of diversity within the open source ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it's actually shaped it quite a lot, because I think that so when I was a sysadmin, this was back in, like I said, in the 90s. There were not a lot of women sysadmins back then. There weren't a lot of women in IT, period. But in particular, system administration didn't seem to have very many at all. And so I think that when I started working in open source, I was still sort of taking it for granted that there just wouldn't be that many women. And it was just, I think I just assumed that that was the way it was, and that I didn't really think much about it. But more, later in my open source career, I worked with a few people like, Kara Souls, who worked on my team at Puppet, and now she works at GitHub. And I think she was, in a lot of cases, sort of instrumental in helping me understand why some of some things were really important from a diversity and inclusion standpoint because I guess I really didn't understand the importance of, of codes of conduct, about, maybe having alcohol-free drinks at events, and there's so many things that you can do to make the spaces that we work in open source more inclusive to, all people. And I really would say that I hadn't really thought about it as much until I worked with Kara, and I think she really opened my eyes into why why some of these things are so important. And then within the chaos project, getting involved in the diversity, equity, and inclusion working group, we started developing metrics, and I think that gave me a lot more insight into why diversity, equity, and inclusion is so important. And then I think that seeing it firsthand, how just wonderful and inclusive the chaos project is, I think really helped me see the benefits of focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because now I think it is super important, and I just can't even overestimate the amount of importance that it has within our communities. And I wished I'd come to that realization earlier. So it took me a while, but it is so important.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the fact that you basically were quite transparent about how you began to actually realize that we have, should I call it shortage of women within the open source ecosystem, and mentioning the chaos projects, which is one project I really do um, admire what you guys do. I wanted to find out what are some of the strategies that you might be thinking of, or you think that you're doing at the moment, that would bring in more women into the open source projects that you currently working.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things that are really critical to bringing more women and people from other underrepresented groups into open source. I think one is, if you look at the leadership and you can see people who look like you can see other women, you can see other people from other underrepresented groups. I think that helps a lot. And I look in particular at the Chaos Project, at our governing board, which is very diverse. And I think that certainly the leadership certainly drives that. But I also just think, being welcoming and being helpful, and just treating people really, really
Mm-hmm.
well. I think that is going to help bring more people into the community, and I think in particular more women. And I've seen this too with Open UK. So I'm on the board of Open UK, and the board is roughly, I think half women, and you can really see it when you come to Open UK events, that there are a lot of women at these events. And so I do think that having people in leadership positions makes a big difference, because people can see that they're welcome, that there are lots of other people like them in these events, in these spaces, and in various activities. And I think that definitely helps.
Mm. I think that also recently I interviewed someone, and one of the things that she shared is basically being the only woman basically in a particular leadership role can also be frustrating. Are there
Mhm.
strategies that you think that communities could basically use to ensure that they are more like equality within the women and other gender within the leadership board of open source projects?
Yeah, I think it can be a real
Mm-hmm.
challenge. I think that it takes proactive recruitment. I think especially if you're a project that hasn't had a lot of women involved in the past. So, like you said, if somebody's the only woman in that space, it can be really hard to recruit more. But I think being proactive about it can help, and and asking people for specific things. So finding people who have the skills that you need within that community, and asking them to participate and encouraging them to participate. I mean, I got involved in, there was one particular group within the CNCF, the contributor strategy technical advisory group. I was doing a community strategy position at VMware, and I'd sort of heard of this group, and I thought, oh, I should see what this is all about. And I showed up to a meeting, and someone I knew from another community, from the Kubernetes community, Paris Pittman. I showed up at this first meeting, and she looked at me and she's like, "Hey, we need someone to write a project health guide. You should help us do that." And so, it was sort of my first meeting. I wasn't really all that involved, but she saw me there and she really wanted my help with something, which made me feel good, made me feel appreciated, and now I've stuck around and ended up a co-chair of
Yeah.
that particular group. But it was because she was proactive and encouraging and really kind of wanted me in that space.
So I think that is basically having a welcoming onboarding strategy, basically, um, are one of the things that could keep women within an open source project and also possibly lead them up to a leadership role rather. This brings me on to another question. I know that I'm looking at the time. I promised you 30 minutes, and every other person can, contribute to this in for the next 15 minutes. So, winding down into how we started our conversation, and you basically explained some practical insights or into how you basically manage burnout and all of that. Um, I have a story of um, a contributor, a lady that started contributing to an open source project and finds that she was not treated well. Although she's quite inspired by this project, but she's not basically content with the way she's being treated. What would be your advice for such a person? What should she do?
Yeah, that is really unfortunate, and I really hate seeing examples of that. And I've seen other examples, similar situations. Um, there are a couple of things you can do. One is, if honestly, if the people who are treating you badly are the people in the leadership positions, regardless of how much you might like that software, I probably wouldn't bother. I would probably walk away from the project, to be honest. And if they're not the people in the leadership positions, if there are other people that someone can talk to and say, hey, I don't really feel welcome, and ask for suggestions from somebody else who's already in the community, that I think can help, especially if there are other women in the community who maybe have been successful for a while, asking them what their tips are. But the reality is, and this is something uh, I talk about a lot, because I think that a lot of maintainers really, they end up in these maintainership and leadership positions within open source projects because of their technical skills. And I think what a lot of maintainers in particular underestimate is that moving into a maintainership position is essentially becoming a manager, and you need to develop some managerial leadership skills as a part of that, and understanding how to communicate with people, how to be encouraging, how to bring people up into leadership positions, and grow people the way you would if you were a manager at a company. You focus on your employees and figuring out ways for them to be more and more successful. And as a maintainer, that's really part of your job. You are a manager, and you need to be thinking about how you can get more people involved, how you can encourage people, how you can mentor people so that they can learn the skills that they need in order to be successful. And so I think that really thinking about maintainership positions as managerial positions might help some maintainers sort of get over some of their issues in dealing with people. And I love to see maintainers focused on building some of these leadership skills that they need in order to be more successful.
I mean, that's one of the most interesting insight I've gained from what you've said for maintainers to basically get the leadership skills required. Um, because also, someone said that because most of this maintenance, they built this project. And so even if there are complaints as to being treated wrongly by, someone else, um, contributors are handicapped. What it means is they really can't do so much to this maintenance because they want to keep the projects going on. So from what you shared now, possibly we should have more speaking engagement that would basically let maintainers know that they need more skills to become open source maintainers. That would help grow the open source community. Winding down to more like the last part of my question before I allow some contributions from the audience and from the listeners. Um, we have cases where people actually talk more about criticism and negative feedbacks. I think for the last two interviews I've had, we've had women face cases, practical experiences of their work and their contribution being criticized or being looked at in a way that is not a proper open source contribution. Let me put it that way. What do you think that we could do in this case?
Yeah, it's a hard situation, right? And it tends to happen in communities that aren't particularly friendly and open and focused on building a diverse and inclusive environment. Like I said, I think, if there are other people who can provide you advice from within that community of ways that that they've been able to get over some of this criticism, and in some cases, I really think that so it's this is something that I've learned to be a bit careful about over my career is that negative or so feedback often feels like criticism, whether it is or it's not. And then sometimes in open source communities it definitely is. But I think if you try to just treat it like feedback, that you need to figure out how to make a change and what it is that you've contributed, and not take it as criticism, even when it maybe
Mhm.
is, but not try to make it not feel that way. I think that can help, because I think in a lot of cases we do tend to take things
Mhm.
personally. People, not just women, just people in
Yeah.
general. When somebody's giving you negative feedback, it's really easy to take that
Mhm.
personally. And as much as you can kind of strip the personal bits out and focus on what you need to do to make your contributions work better for this particular community, might be able to help. In other cases, like I said, sometimes you end up with toxic maintainers,
Mhm.
and there's no amount of change that you're going to be able to do to fix things. And so in some cases it's better for your own, I think, sort of mental health and well-being to walk away from some of these communities if they are really truly that toxic.
Mm. I mean, there's no better way to say it. It's either you look at it as an advice for growth, or you decide to, look for other projects to work on rather than being in a toxic
Yeah,
space. So,
yeah.
moving on to a particular question. I got this question from some of the listeners here. Send me this question. Do you think, are you looking at doing anything within the Chaos project that would be solely for women?
um No, not for me
Mm-hmm.
particularly around the data science. I don't think. I think that Elizabeth Barron, our community manager, is probably a little bit more focused in this area and looking at ways to get more women involved. I would certainly love to see a lot more women involved in the Chaos Project, and I will certainly encourage. I do know some data scientists, women data scientists that already are involved in the Chaos Project, and I'll probably try to get them even more involved in some of the data science initiatives. So I think it's something that we'll probably do a little bit of, and we'll see how successful it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the data science bits are just starting within the Chaos
Yeah.
Project, but it might be possible to do some internships or something in the
Mm-hmm.
future, that we might be able to focus on women or in other areas. But I don't have any plans for that right now. But I also haven't figured out exactly what I'm going to be
Of
doing
course.
yet as the as the director of data science. That's my first task in August when I get back.
Uh-huh. Okay. And I'm looking forward to read more of your blogs about as you progress in your role, honestly. Um,
Yeah, thank you.
So, before I open up for listeners basically, and the co-host is going to handle this part, listeners can share their insight or they have questions for you. Um, what do you think basically is some of the most exciting things going on around open source at the moment? What gets you excited within the open source ecosystem?
Yeah, there are a few things that get me excited about the open source ecosystem right now. One is, and we've talked about this already, but one is the focus that I'm seeing lately on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So, things like the event badging program that Chaos has been doing, but they're also looking at doing DEI badges more generally for projects and working in conjunction with GitHub to do that and encouraging people to have a, DEI.md file where they talk about their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So I am really excited to see the progress that we've been making in DEI and seeing that starting to progress in a, I think maybe in a bigger way. I find that really exciting. I also, getting back to the data science bits, I also find, some of the AI and machine learning stuff that's, starting to spin up, and we're still trying to figure out what that means from an open source perspective. But that is also something that I'm finding really interesting.
Mm. I also think that AI and the DI badging stuff going on within the Chaos project is actually very interesting. I feel like every open source project should actually be part of that one. Um, and that the Chaos project has basically led um, most open source projects, including GNOME, basically on how to be, more inclusive and build a diverse environment. I wouldn't say that within the open source project we have gotten it all right, but I think that there's quite a level of improvement, like you said, and some communities are intentionally taking diversity and inclusion more seriously, and I'm happy about that one, honestly. Um, so I'm going to leave now because I know that um, most people would have questions for you, Dr. Don. And so Atinuke, which is the co-host, is going to unmute anyone. If you have questions for Dr. Don that you would like her to address directly, please raise your hand. I think I'm seeing Ruth. She has a question. Our co-host is going to unmute you and you can speak.
Hi, Don. Hi, Regina. Thank you for organizing this and big fan here of Don. So I have a question, Don, about I'm kind of curious on what. Oh, I think I got muted. Oh, weird. Um, so my question is, I'm kind of curious. What were your challenges, or what have been your challenges so far, and how, like, throughout your career, and how were you able to navigate them? Because um I think I've known you for quite some time, and I've listened to most of your talks, and you're one of like my big inspirations. So I'd love to know the challenges you've experienced so far and how you were able to navigate through them.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. For the record, I'm also a big fan of Ruth as well and what she's done in particular with Chaos Africa. So we're just gonna have dueling fangirlisms right now. But as far as challenges go, I think um, I think one of the challenges, in particular with open source projects, is really where to start, right? So you look at these communities and you could, I don't know, you just don't even know where to start. I mean, maybe there are some good first issues, maybe there are some help wanted labels, but it still can be really difficult to get engaged in some of these communities. And so I think one of the things that I would encourage people to do is to just go and listen and, read the mailing list, listen to meetings, see if you can get a better feel for what's going on and who's doing what, and then start talking to individual people about the work that they're doing within some of these communities and seeing if there's some ways for you to get involved. Because I think that that is probably the biggest challenge from an open source perspective. And then I would say personally for me in, kind of company career wise, I think my biggest challenge has been balancing the work that I do and learning to say no to things, because there's always so many interesting things going on and you want to say yes to absolutely everything because it sounds so interesting and it's fascinating and you just want to be involved in all the things. And I have learned that in order to for me not to get burnt out, I need to say no to things. So that I think is one of the biggest challenges that I continue to have this challenge, right? It's easy to look at things and be like, oh, I want to do that too. But knowing that you have so many hours in a day, and if you say yes to this other thing, then you're going to have to say no to something else. So I think that's probably the other biggest challenge that I've had career wise. It's just being able to figure out what to say yes to and what to say no to in order to protect my own well being and mental health. Thanks for the question, Ruth.
Yeah,
That was a good
sure.
one.
Thanks for sharing as well.
We have a request from Chris, quotes Christy. I'm just going to try it. So, oh, now you can speak now. You can speak now.
Oh, okay, I just wanted to make sure because Twitter Spaces has been buggy.
Yeah.
Anyway, hey, Dr. Dawn. As far as the question, what advice do you have for maintainers who want to bring in more of a diverse, create more of a diverse team, but without like coming off as like, I don't know, pandering?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, one of the things that you can do when you're trying to build a more diverse team around an open source project is to think about what would make newcomers feel more welcome and feel like they can really be a part of the project. Like once they participate, actually move into leadership positions. So we really, I encourage people to, with their projects, to put together good governance documents and things like contributor ladders where people can see that, I start contributing and after I've been contributing a while, maybe I can move up to be an approver or reviewer or whatever roles you have in your project. I think that's an excellent place to start. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get more diverse people involved, but by having some of that documented, then I think you can more easily move people into leadership positions in general. And then I think, being able to do this without, like you said, pandering, I think talking to people who might be interested, getting involved in related open source communities that are already more diverse, where you can maybe encourage some people to also participate in your project. I think that can sometimes help. I think if you have funding or can get funding for things like outreachy internships, for example, where you could do internships for women. I think that can sometimes help.
Oh,
But
okay.
I think a lot of these approaches end up being kind of one on one, and I think that that's how a lot of these projects start getting more diverse is by talking to people and encouraging people to participate.
Thank you. Thank you. And this my next thought. It's not so much of a question, but it's something that I've kind of started doing. I too noticed that women were not being amplified in the open source community. So I started a group on Daily Squad called Open Source Queens, and it's basically where I encourage women and non binary people to share their stories about maintainership, their experiences contributing to projects, basically anything. I want to hear your story, and let y'all know that you're heard and you'll be amplified. So yeah, if you're interested, I just posted the tweet in the jumbotron. So hopefully I'll see you there.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a really good idea. I think that we do need spaces where we can kind of talk to each other and provide sort of mutual support and amplification of what we're all doing. So that's great. Thanks.
And another thing is that a friend of mine started this repo called Women Led Open Source after she read my tweet about not seeing enough women led open source projects. So if y'all are looking for um, projects to contribute to, you can just go to the repo as well. So
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing all that as well. Do we have anyone else with a question? Do you have a question for Dr. Dunn? There's something you would want to say to her? Mm. Okay, why I'm basically looking out for requests. So Dr. Dunn, one question I get all the time is in your own words, what would you say to any young person out there, possibly out of school like yourself years back, that is looking to contribute to open source and is maybe confused as to where to start? What would your advice be to such a person?
Yeah, getting started in open source projects can be hard in general, and I think it's just doubly so when you're relatively new in your career and just coming out of university. I would there are a couple of things that I would recommend. I would recommend finding a project that is very newcomer friendly so that it's a little bit easier to get involved, especially if this is the first place where you're contributing. So chaos certainly pretty newcomer friendly. There are other groups that have so if you look at Kubernetes, for example, has a contributor experience group which is focused on helping to make the contributor experience better for Kubernetes contributors. And places like that can be an interesting place to get involved in some of these projects because it's a little bit easier to focus on helping in more community oriented tasks than it is to just to start contributing to Kubernetes right off the bat, right?
Mhm.
It's pretty complex. But there are projects like that that have a big focus on newcomers or a big focus on making the community better, the contributor experience better, and those can be good places to I think get started. So I'd recommend finding something that's a nice friendly space to get involved in.
Yeah, and I think that it is important to know that having a newcomer friendly um, project is very key. And right now in the GNOME project, we are looking to get more experience with this, with newcomers and having to know how to onboard them in. And so we are also, getting more people that has the experience of building onboarding experience, great onboarding experience. Possibly we could work together and see what we could do within the GNOME project. So, I mean, what she has just said is really, really key. Look out for a welcoming community and see how you could basically, get inspired by coming in from the community side of things before you begin to do, the technical stuffs. So what are your last words? What would you like to say to the listeners?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say don't get discouraged. Open source is a really big space, and if you try one thing and it doesn't really work out well, keep trying, try something else, try a different project, try a different type of contribution. But I would really say, don't get discouraged. There are a lot of really great open source projects out there and a lot of really amazing people So I think just keep trying until you find the one that really fits with what you're trying to do and the type of person you are and the type of community that it is. Because I think, I think just about everybody can be successful within open source if you just find the right community and find the right space for you.
I think that's the best thing you just said. Find the right community and find the right space for you. Thank you so much, Dr. Don, for joining us this evening. I really enjoyed this section with you. And like I said at the beginning of this space, this particular space is going to be converted to a podcast and it's be shared across Amazon, Google Podcast, and Apple Podcast. And so you could go back to listen to this or share with someone that is finding it difficult to basically come into open source projects. And thank you, all listeners that's joined. Thank you, Atenike, for being a short time co-host. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you, all the listeners. Thank you, Don, as well. I wish you a beautiful evening. And if it's morning at your end, a beautiful morning. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks for having me.